Welcome back to the Road to Great Health podcast. I'm Dr. Kevin Lenderman from South Louisiana, and I am joined as always by Dr. Rob DeMartino, the only man in Las Vegas whose idea of a hot streak is a series of good heteroplasmy rates. Doc, what's up?
That's right. All
You
that
like
sun
that
out
one
here is how you
today?
get that. I do like that. That's great. I'm doing great. How are you doing?
I'm doing good, man. Number 33 today.
33. We're cruising.
Here we are. And we're going to talk about water and hydration today. And I've got to start by just picking with the ladies a little bit today. And in
Okay.
South Louisiana, when we say I'm just picking, that means like, no offense, I'm just joking with you. And
Okay.
we only pick at people we like. And so
Right.
if you're at a party or something and somebody's not picking with you, that means they probably don't like you very much.
Okay.
And so, if somebody's picking with you, that means they're liking you, they're digging you, right? But we've kind of lost our minds a little bit on carrying the water around with us. I mean, the giant Stanley cups, the half a gallon of water to go to Costco. We've gone a little crazy on carry. People didn't used to carry water around unless they were crossing the Great Plains on a wagon train, or crossing the Lewis and Clark Pass or something like that. And now these ladies will carry a half a gallon of water to go to Marshall's and pick the kids up from school. And,
Yeah.
and we check them, right? They're still all dehydrated, right, Doc?
Yep, for sure. Yeah. Oh, we get it. We get it here too. I mean, trust me, it's 100 and something degrees. It's, they got the water bottles with them because it's the desert and you kind of need it. But there's just a lot, it's funny. We probably should have done this before podcast 33. There's a lot of misconceptions around water.
There really isn't. And you guys are going to find by the end of the podcast today that the way you've been thinking your body gains hydration is slightly different than how much water you drink. There's a lot more to the story than that, because when we check these people that say, "Doc, I physically could not drink any more water," and they're still dehydrated, there has to be more to the story. And so we're going to get into all that today on, why hydration is important, what water actually does, what type of water you should be drinking. And so we're going to go deep into the details of all of that. And so, Doc, let me just start by asking, uh, as far as hydration goes, I know that there's some new types of water out there that people may have never heard of. And so, can you talk just a little bit about, Pollock's work on the fourth phase of water, and let's get into that first, and what that actually means?
Yeah, so the first scientist to actually bring that to light was a guy named Gilbert Ling, and now Gerald Pollack is who you referred to. He's kind of brought it to more of the forefront. So most people know, we're taught in like elementary school, that there's three phases of water, right? Solid, liquid, and gas form. But now they've actually discovered that there's a fourth phase of water, and this fourth phase of water sits somewhere between a solid and a liquid. It's kind of like this crystalline gel structure thing. It's kind of, it's not liquid, it's not solid, but it's an incredibly important type of water that our bodies actually make. So it's kind of one of those things that I remember when I was a kid. I remember asking the teacher, like, how do camels survive in the desert or whatever. I always had weird questions when I was a kid, and the teacher was like, well, they store water in their humps. And I was like, okay, that would make some sense, right? It's equivalent to people carrying around water bottles, right? But then, now as we're learning all these things now, really what it is camels, yeah, they store that water, but they're not drinking that water and then storing it there. They are incredibly efficient at making water. So camels' bodies take sunlight and basically convert it into water. And human beings have that capability of doing that as well too. And it's not really talked about. Most people don't know that your body actually makes water every single day, and significantly more water than you actually drink. Even if you drink a lot of water, right? Even if you're one of those people who are all excited that your pee has no color, right? You still make more water than you drink out. We just don't have the capability of storing it that like the camels do. But it's this idea of this exclusion zone, fourth phase water that's sitting between that liquid and solid state that we find lining inside of our cells. And it's interesting that, here we are all these years later, and we're still talking about new things that, water is this very basic thing. And we're still talking about new things about water and how drastically important this is to the human body. And we'll get into some of the science of that. But the fact that there exists this fourth phase of water and the fact that our bodies are what is producing that water outside explains the fact of, people, I ask people like, hey, what did the doctor say about this lab marker that's off? They said, well, they said I'm dehydrated. But how can I be dehydrated? They're right in a sense, right? It means you're dehydrated, but it means you're dehydrated because it's not the water that you're drinking. You're not making enough of the water on your own.
Yeah. So this exclusion zone water is much more useful for our body than just regular like and by the way, for the purpose of the podcast, when I say faucet water, I'm talking about bulk water, whether it comes from a filter, a faucet, a bottle, your refrigerator. When we just say faucet water, I just mean regular water that you can be drinking. And so the exclusion zone water actually is healthier for our cells than regular water.
Yeah, it does a higher level of hydration and then significantly beyond that. Do you ever drink a lot of water and then you go running around and you kind of feel it slushing around in your belly, right? That's
Right.
what we call bulk water. You use the term, right? So
Yeah.
bulk water is not really absorbed. Some people talk about like, using electrolytes or using salt to try to absorb the water better. There's something to that. But again, it's this hydration that we make in our mitochondria to basically hydrate the inside of our cells. And the more of this exclusion zone water that we make, if you think of this like a battery, that exclusion zone water is another place where we can store energy in the form of charge inside the human body. So essentially, it would be like the more exclusion zone water that your mitochondria, your healthy mitochondria in your cells make, the larger battery capacity that you have. So it would be like your cell phone having a bigger battery, right? So it could last many more hours, or you could hook the extra battery packs onto that could last many more hours. There is a direct relationship to hydration and the human battery, but it is also that hydration, we have to separate those different types of waters. It's still important to drink water. I'm not saying don't drink water, right? But it is important that we make sure that, even the average person's drinking 1 to maybe 2 liters of water a day if they're really hydrated, depending upon their size. But the body's going to make about 4 liters of water a day. So when you're dehydrated, most of the time it's coming from cellular dehydration, not from exogenous water drinking.
Yeah. Yeah, that's super interesting. Now back in the hunter-gatherer days when we drank from streams and lakes and rivers, that water was more leaning towards the exclusion zone, more absorbable water for us.
Sure, because it's moving, right? So
Yeah.
think about anytime we need to create energy in any system, we create motion, right? So especially vortexing, right? Water that's spinning or water that's running, or, and obviously it's getting a lot more mineral deposits versus the water that we typically get is dead. It's bulk. It's just sitting there. It's static, right? It's there's no movement to that. But running water is very energizing for the human body. Static water is not. Think about a pool that you shut the filter off, that water doesn't stay nice and blue very long, right? It gets pretty green and funky pretty quickly. So we want that water moving. So water that's running through streams, water that's coming down waterfalls. Think about all the things that create movement and how much energy that they generate. Black holes spin, they create power, right? Tornadoes, damaging, but they spin and they create an awful lot of power. You're right in the middle of Tornado Alley over there
Yeah.
in Louisiana, right?
Right.
Even the human heart, right? The human heart is designed to basically, it's why we have 4 chambers. It's designed for as the blood comes in, it's basically goes down like a funnel and it spins itself out. And that's how we're able to get our blood charged up and pushed off to other places, which your blood is 93% water, right? So most of the earth is water. Most of our bodies are water. I can't underestimate how important this water component is for us.
Yeah, and you can go weeks without food, days without water. So water is definitely important for our cells. And let's dig a little bit into the mitochondria producing water, because at my new patient class a few days ago, I showed them a picture of the electron transport chain, and your mitochondria kick out 2 things: ATP for energy and water. And so if someone is chronically dehydrated, that also means they are in energetic debt. And so I know it always comes back to the mitochondria, but that's because it always comes back to the mitochondria.
It does, right? The body has one very sole requirement, which is energy. And we get the
Right.
majority of that from mitochondrial function. But it's interesting because mitochondria, like you said, mitochondria is going to make ATP, right? So mitochondria have to transform energy, right? So the creation idea is a little bit different, right? So it's going to take materials, it's going to take food, it's going to take sunlight, and it's going to convert that into a form of energy that we can use, right? And that form of energy is what we call ATP. So when your mitochondria are working great, they have a huge electrical charge inside of them, which we would talk about as voltage, right? That pulls oxygen. We combine oxygen with fat and these hydrogens, and then that allows us to kick out a tremendous amount of ATP. Because we're using oxygen, we get carbon dioxide the same way we breathe oxygen in and blow carbon dioxide out. We're going to get carbon dioxide development, and we're going to get a lot of this exclusion zone water. And it was interesting because I remember being in graduate school, and I asked one of the professors, in our one course where you go over like the tiniest little bit that you go over about mitochondria, like the one section of the one course that they actually teach you anything about this. And I said to him, I was like, well, this math isn't mathing, right? Like it doesn't make sense. Like if your heart takes this much ATP, right? So we've talked about it before, like a 150-pound person who lives a relatively sedentary life needs about 180 pounds of ATP a day. And I'm looking at the amount that the heart would need. And I'm doing the math and I'm going, there's no way that ATP fires this whole system by itself. There's just no way it can do it, right? And I remember the professor kind of didn't answer me, but I remember thinking to myself, well, this is what's accepted, but this math doesn't make sense. Like there's no way we would have enough energy to do everything if this is how much it takes. And now they've proven that ATP can't be the only energy source. It just can't. If ATP was the only energy source for the human body, it would literally break the laws of thermodynamics by 500-fold. Right? It's just not possible. So now what they know is that we make this ATP, and we always talk about that as energy. And I'm guilty of this too, because a lot of the times, especially when I'm talking with patients, I'm trying to keep this simple, right? Because I don't want to overwhelm. I'm not trying to take them back to 12th grade chemistry classes and stuff like that. But this water component of it is a huge charge and a huge percentage of the energy that the human body makes, to where now we know the ATP's function is to bind to your proteins so that they can open themselves up, right? So proteins have to fold in order to be able to work. They open themselves up, and that way we can attach the water to them. So it's like basically attaching a battery pack and a jet pack to these proteins. So when they need that energy, they can fire it off in a really efficient way. Now, again, the traditional science doesn't get this, right? Gilbert Ling was the first guy to talk about this. He talked about this way back in the 70s. And of course, they said he was nuts. They said he's a heretic, he's a lunatic. He only since recently passed away, and thankfully for us, he had like a huge ego and was like incredibly smart and like we really care about it. But he kept pushing that, and now of course we're like, wow, he was 100% right. But as it always happens, they're validated after after their time is gone. But you're talking about rescinding Nobel prizes, not that they were malicious in intent, but it's just not the correct model. But when we talk about that, that's why when you see those dehydration markers on labs, this person's going to be energy efficient. They're talking about it like you're just dehydrated, drink more water. We're looking at it going, hey, look, we can't necessarily measure directly ATP, but if we can measure this water status, if that water's low, so is your ATP. And whatever it means is, like you said, one way or the other, you're in energy debt.
Yeah, it tells us the mitochondria just aren't working.
That's not
And
working.
so yeah, and so the difference between that and bulk water is bulk water goes through your body. This charged water goes in your body so that your body can use it. And so it's really interesting, when we drink, we have machines that make this exclusion zone water. When you drink it, you don't have to pee all the time because it's going in your body to run your mitochondria. It's not just going through your kidneys and you're peeing it all out.
It's an interesting paradox, right? Because you would think if I drink water and I pee it out immediately, like I'm topped off, right? Like I don't need any more to absorb. Like it just could go right through me because I'm full of water. But it's actually the opposite of what it means. It means you're dehydrated. People who don't go to the bathroom very often tend to have actually better water creation because you're not having to constantly bring in this water. You're supporting it through that way. It's the same thing. Where you see this the most is the people who tell me like, Doc, I don't sleep real well because I'm up all night going to the bathroom. Right. I'm up
Right.
3, 4 times going to the bathroom. One time maybe is reasonable enough. but 3 to 4 times to go to the bathroom. If that's happening to you, then we're dehydrated on the cellular level because those mitochondria are not chunking out enough ATP and enough of this exclusions of water.
Yeah, I was talking to a patient yesterday. It was a young girl with POTS, and she said she gets up 4 to 5 times at night to pee, and she goes, "Yeah, but that's just normal for me." Go, no, that's that's not normal
Mhm.
for you. Like if you were a 70-year-old man, I might give you a couple of times at night to have to get up and pee. But a young girl, she's in her teenage years, getting up 4 or 5 times, that is very abnormal. That is not a normal thing at
Yeah.
all.
Yeah, it's a bad sign, you know, and again,
Right,
it's something that we'll push into. Well, it's common. Yeah, it's common, but it doesn't mean it's good, right? Common and
right.
normal are not the same things, but it's a big warning sign when you're looking at it from our perspective in the biophysics of it all, just the energy decline that's happening.
Yeah, there's some really strange things that water does, and changes its shape, it changes its crystalline structure. I know there was a Japanese scientist who showed that water could actually change form around negativity versus, positivity. I think there's a lot more about water that we still don't fully understand.
Yeah, it's a lot more structured, right? I think the best example you could see it with when you look at like snowflakes, right? Like,
Yeah.
the way that they form, but they form very organized, right? They form in this very crystalline, organized fashion, and the water is either disorganized and organized. And and you're talking about, sometimes when I say things like, quantum, like quantum biology or quantum physics and things like that, people think like when you put quantum in front of words, it's just woo woo and crazy, and it's just not. But quantum physics it actually is the most scientifically proven type of physics that exists, even though we tend to kind of view it as not. But anything that's quantum just has to do with electrons and protons. So the second you start talking about, electron charge and proton charges and charges inside the human body, you move into the ideology of quantum physics. And this exclusion zone water allows us to hold a net negative charge. And the human body, not that we want to be negative, like personality wise or emotionally wise or viewpoint wise, but we want to hold a negative charge inside the body. The body needs a negative charge. Think of it like a battery. We need a negative charge in order to be able to work. And again, that's part of the process inside of your mitochondria is to separate these charges so that we can make this ATP, we can make this water. These are quantum mechanics ideology that again we're trying to keep really, really simple here. Um, but obviously one of the other biggest things about water is not only does this water that your mitochondria needs to make, does it need to be exclusion zone, does it need to be fourth phase, but it also needs to have certain types of hydrogen. And I don't know if you want to get into this today, or maybe we need to have a whole
Yeah.
other podcast. But there's this ideology of what we need to call it needs to be exclusion zone deuterium depleted water, and we can define terms there. But this is a huge topic that's starting to gain traction in the medical world. But we've been talking about it in quantum biology for years.
Yeah. Yeah, I first heard you say deuterium like 15 years ago, and like so many of the things you talk about here, I've known you long enough now that like 15 years later, all of a sudden the smart researchers are starting to talk about deuterium. It's like, Dr. Rob talked about that like 15 years ago.
I
Yeah, I
know.
know what that is. But so yeah, let's get into the story of deuterium because that's very interesting. And so we could talk about hydrogen and deuterium depleted water and why that's so important because I think that's something nobody's ever even heard of.
No, it's really not. I talk to patients about it all the time, and they're like, I don't know what you're talking about. And I've always been kind of held back on it in social media because, again, I'm trying not to put out terms that nobody knows what they mean, right? Because then that it just creates more confusion. But I was like, look, it's an important topic. We have to talk about it. And I just did a video about it, and everyone was like kind of blown away, like, what in the hell? But then if you look it up, it's all the science behind it. So what is
Right.
deuterium, right? So water is H2O, right? So it means we got hydrogens connected with oxygens. So there are what we call isotopes, different isotopes of all the elements, right? And isotopes basically mean what their chemical configuration looks like. So there are different isotopes of hydrogen, right? So there is a light form of hydrogen from a molecular weight standpoint, right? And then there are heavier forms, heavier isotopes of hydrogen. And deuterium is a heavier type of hydrogen. It's basically double the molecular weight of light hydrogen. And then there's a third type of hydrogen that's even heavier than that, but that's pretty rare. But deuterium is a naturally occurring thing, right? So it's not foreign, but it's much more rare than regular light hydrogen. And we have deuterium in our system, right? So we're made up of carbons and hydrogens, and those hydrogens are massively important for us because in our mitochondria, when we have the big charge, they make energy by spinning, right? So mitochondria are like big rotary jet engines. They spin and they spin fast, 9,000 rotations per minute. And you really like try to think about that. That's an incredibly fast speed. It's faster than jet engines. So it makes sense if you've ever looked at the periodic table of elements, hydrogen is in the upper corner because it is the lightest element. So it makes sense that nature chose hydrogen as the fuel to spin this engine because if it's dependent upon how fast it can go, the lighter the element is, the faster it goes, right? But if deuterium becomes the type of hydrogen that gets into our mitochondria, then all of a sudden now you've put something that has double the amount of weight in an engine that needs to spin incredibly fast. And it would be no different that if you put, if you're doing bench presses and you double the amount of weight on the bar, you're not going to be able to do as many, and you're certainly not going to be able to do them as fast. And it's going to create a lot more force and effort to try to be able to push that up. So deuterium is this naturally occurring hydrogen, but it should never, ever be the form of hydrogen that builds up in your system. And it should never, ever be the type of form of hydrogen that gets into your mitochondria because it will break those engines. It will destroy their function. It will decrease the output of ATP. It will destroy the production of exclusion-zone water, which means your battery will die out way quicker. It will cause your proteins to misfold. It is in every single case of mast cell activation syndrome that I've ever seen. You find deuterium as a player every single time without fail. Don't even check for it anymore. Just know it's there because deuterium aggravates mast cells to create them to create a lot of histamine. This is the most potent toxin in high levels. It's normal and normal. It's good at normal levels. High levels and in the wrong place. This is the most potent toxin to your mitochondria. I get mercury's bad. I get aluminum's bad. I get all those things are bad. I'm not saying they're good. I'm telling you, deuterium is a much bigger problem to your mitochondria that no one's ever told you about.
Yeah, that's so fascinating. And if you think of something that spins that fast, it would be like putting a baseball on a string and swinging in a circle versus putting a bowling ball on a string and trying to spin that same speed. It would be next to impossible to do that. And you know, so so light hydrogen is a proton and electron, right?
Yeah. So what makes them light, what they call protium is the light form of hydrogen. It has a single electron and a single proton. Deuterium has the
And
same structure, except it's got a big old neutron stuck in the middle
yeah,
there as well too. And that neutron doubles
right.
the weight.
Yeah, doubles the weight. And it doesn't really have a different charge because the neutron's neutral, right?
Neutron's neutral, but it's
Right.
just a sheer. And again, you're talking about microscopic size here, but
Yeah.
double the weight is double the weight. Doesn't matter,
Right.
right? Just double the weight is
Right.
double the weight. It doesn't matter.
Yeah. So your mitochondria are trying to swing that bowling ball instead of swinging that baseball, and it slows. Like Doc said, it breaks the whole system. Now, deuterium is a real problem today in a lot of these chronic conditions that we treat, and Dr. Rob actually created a way to help remove some of that deuterium out of the system, and there are other other scientists and other people that are working. They sell deuterium depleted water, and this is really a thing. But what I've found in my practice is, when we have that patient that we're doing everything right and they're sort of stuck, a lot of times when we start working on deuterium, boom, they take off again. They get over that plateau, and they start to hit that next level like we've sort of been expecting. And so there are places where we're getting more deuterium now than normal, right? Like why do we have more deuterium now than in the past?
There's a couple of different reasons for that, right? So foods, certain areas of the world will have more deuterium, right? If you live closer to coastlines, you'll have more deuterium. The higher up you go in altitude, you have more deuterium. Part of the reason for that is the those areas will always have typically higher levels of sunlight. Obviously, the higher up you go, the closer you are. And obviously more towards coastal lines, you're typically going to get more sunlight. So Proper sunlight exposure helps with what we call deuterium depletion. Your body has an entire system to get deuterium out of your system, and it needs high levels of sunlight to do that. And we need adequate REM sleep to do that, because your body depletes deuterium at night when you go into REM sleep. And again, when most people are checking their watches or their rings or Aura rings or whatever, I had somebody who was like, I haven't gotten REM sleep like ever. Like, I just don't get it. Like, every time I track it, I just don't get it. So again, he's not going to be able to deplete deuterium because that's when it happens. So depending upon where you live, now certain foods have a lot higher levels of deuterium. Things like fruits and vegetables are going to have a lot higher levels of deuterium in them. But again, those types of foods are typically grown in really high sunlight. So when the foods are grown in really high sunlight, your body assumes if you're eating that type of food, you are also in really high sunlight. So it will allow you to be able to deuterium deplete faster. But if you're living this indoor, blue light driven, EMF filled world, where you're going to get exposed to all of these different types of alien fields and not a lot of sunlight typically, now all of a sudden you're eating fruits and stuff like that, you're loading your body with this deuterium. And then when you couple into the fact that most people don't sleep well with that as well, because they don't have enough sunlight and they don't have that sleep hygiene down, now they can't deplete the deuterium, and then you build these levels up in your system. And deuterium really first started to get its legs in cancer research, because you always find really high levels of deuterium in cancer research. But I'm telling you, if you have an autoimmune disease, if you have POTS, if you have any of these things that require somebody to get a diagnosis, I'm going to tell you now that deuterium is going to build up inside the system, right? And it can be for a number of reasons. You're getting too much, you're not getting enough sunlight, you're not getting the adequate sleep. Now we talked about this a bit last time, but with the Earth's magnetic field weakening, the process of the Earth's magnetic field weakening allows more deuterium type hydrogen to get into our rainfall. So that means then the water content is typically going to go up. And even in the water we are consuming, the water we're going to go up is in deuterium form. So we have to make sure we're exceptionally good at deuterium depleting this. And not to be gross, but I'll tell you, one of the easiest ways to do this is when you wake up in the morning, and hopefully you wake up in the morning and you get that adequate sunlight at first thing in the morning, and then you go and you have your bowel movement. Right, deuterium comes out through bowel movements, right? So it should be, if that bowel movement in the morning is nice and formed, smooth, right? So it's what we call a Bristol number 4. Be careful if you're looking this up on the internet, because there's a Bristol score of what your poop looks like. They usually use diagrams. They don't use like real examples. They use like artistic diagrams, but it should look like that. If it looks like that, your body's deuterium depleting really efficiently. If it doesn't look like that, then your body is not getting that deuterium depletion if we're not getting the REM sleep. And I promise you, this will break your engines. This will destroy your capacity for everything. We talk about protein misfolding. Every neurodegenerative disease that everybody keeps asking me on social media to make videos about, like make a video of how you avoid Alzheimer's, make a video of how you avoid Parkinson's. Protein misfolding is caused by deuterium, right? It's what causes it, right? So, and then there was just a story about a young boy in the Midwest who was playing baseball. He was a young, healthy kid. He was playing baseball. A few hours after the game, got really overheated, got super duper nauseous, and then died. Right? I will promise you that deuterium getting loaded in his systems with heavy exercise like that forces his engines to work against creating that much heat. And if they knew the science around deuterium, they may have been able to help him better than they did. And it's a terribly tragic story. But it will go back around to those deuterium ideologies and examples where it can, if you have high levels of deuterium, I promise you oxygen won't be used well, and exercise will become a toxin to you. Exercise will hurt you because you're asking engines to move against concrete.
Yeah. Yeah. So that would be a very poor exercise tolerance.
Poor exercise tolerance, poor heat tolerance, because now all of a sudden you're going to they overheat like wild.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. If you think of this like in terms of a car engine, for example, the car engines in America have big cylinders that move slow, like a V8. The more Italian cars like Ferraris have smaller cylinders that move faster. So, you got to pick one or the other. You can't have something heavy that moves fast. And so that's what these deuterium loaded mitochondria are trying to do. And it just doesn't work out well. And I find it real interesting when you were talking about, fruits and vegetables grow in the sun. And so they have higher deuterium, but that's because, your body's expecting you to be in the sun to help with that during that time. And one of the things I always found it fascinating that you talked about was we take somebody with genetics from South America, they move to Alaska to get a job, and then we ship them a banana in December. Like they're not supposed to be in Alaska, and they're certainly not supposed to be eating a banana in December. And it's completely incongruent with their normal biology, and that does matter.
Yeah, when you do all that together, remember anything you do inside of the body that creates confusion causes it to inflame, right? So
Yeah.
everyone's shocked why they have all this inflammation. But like, I'm eating healthy food. Yeah, it's healthy food, but it's not healthy for the environment that you're in because it creates a mismatch, and mismatches create inflammatory type process. It's part of the reason why people do so well with carnivore, right? So a
Yeah.
lot of people, and again, I never begrudge people for trying different things, especially when they're really sick. Like I did carnivore and I did really, really well. Part of the reason what they're not understanding is there's this ideology of oh, it's just the food. No, animal fat especially is very low in deuterium. So they're accidentally deuterium depleting themselves. A lot of the times in fasting, people are like, oh, I fast. Well, they're deuterium depleting because they're not putting in the foods that they're typically eating with a lot of deuterium in them. So there's other benefits towards it, but the ideology behind doing those styles of diets is they tend to be very low in deuterium. So if somebody comes in and tells me like, hey, I did really well on carnivore, but I got to a certain point and it stopped working because, okay, yeah, now you pulled the deuterium out, but you're not doing the things to fire those engines. So, again, if carnivore worked for you, deuterium might be part of your story.
Yeah. Is there any testing? Is there any lab testing to test deuterium?
So there were used to be two places where we could do deuterium testing. One of them is not doing it anymore. There's one other place that was doing it, but they just told me this week that their machine broke. And they're trying to work to get it fixed. They're not sure when it's going to get fixed. So there is ways of directly testing it, but usually, again, if you know how to look for the patterns on blood work, you will see these patterns kind of showing up. So what does that ultimately look like? If your carbon dioxide's low on your blood work, if your blood creatinine ratios are high, if you have markers for dehydration issues, right? All of these things are going to typically show you that there's going to be deuterium buildup inside of somebody's system. But again, the most obvious way to know this is, do you have a diagnosis? Right? Do you have a neurodiagnosis? Do you have an autoimmune diagnosis? Do you have a cancer diagnosis? Do you have one of these things? They're always going to go back to mitochondrial function, and especially heart stuff too, right? Heart stuff, heart symptomology, metabolic syndrome, diabetes. If you have diabetes, forget it. I will promise you. If you have fatty liver, forget it. I will promise you have deuterium. If you have sleep apnea, forget it. I will promise you that you have deuterium levels. Like I will tell you that these things will be there. They have to be there. They're a part of the pathophysiology of these types of problems. So yeah, you can identify that stuff on lab work, but half of the time I never even get that far because they tell me they're diabetic and my metabolic syndrome. And I'm like, cool. Do you know what deuterium is? No. I'm like, you're gonna,
Yeah.
because it's going to be important to
Yeah.
get it out of your system because that's what's going to make it work. Visceral fat is where if you have a high level of visceral fat, you have a high level of deuterium. And there's conversations now of, are we putting that deuterium in the visceral fat? Are we gaining weight as Americans because we're trying to protect our bodies against deuterium breaking our mitochondrial function?
Yeah. I know sleep apnea has a huge connection with deuterium. I've heard you say that before, and so does so many of these other conditions. And it's one of those things that just nobody's talking about. But God, it's such an important thing when you start doing the type of mitochondrial work that Dr. Rob teaches. There's just the mitochondria by itself is super complicated. Just figuring out the details of how to resolve those little engines in there, they are as complicated as a little jet engine, and you really have to look at all these aspects and leave no stone unturned whenever it comes to how to help somebody with mitochondrial dysfunction, which is almost every chronic condition on the face of the earth today has something to do with the mitochondria, if not primarily due to some kind of mitochondrial dysfunction for sure.
Yeah,
Well, I
it just comes
hope
down to it.
yeah, yeah. I hope for those of you right now that are in your car with a half a gallon jug of water, I hope that you will have understood that today that there's a lot more to the story. And look, we appreciate you. We know you're worried about your health and you're just trying to stay hydrated. But now, for all those patients that tell us every day, Doc, I physically couldn't drink more water, but I still feel dehydrated. You understand now that it's not your fault, that there's a reason this is happening. And if you fix the mitochondria, you will fix your low energy and you will also fix your hydration. Really super important.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, these are the leverage points that allow somebody, like you said, when they get stuck, these are the things that really tip the scales. If we're not talking about this, and again, you're just not going to get this in biochemistry. These are biophysics concepts. But when you can apply the biophysics to the body, all of a sudden these unexplainable things become really explainable.
Yeah, and you just have to find somebody that's willing to dig into this and outside of that typical standard of care with your one page of blood work, looking at your cholesterol and blood sugar and telling you you're fine, even though you don't feel fine. There are physical things that are broken in your body that we have to search out and come up with a very methodical strategy in order to resolve them. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Doc. Today was very interesting. The whole thing with water is just fascinating.
I've been waiting to go into deuterium. That's one of my favorite topics.
Yeah,
You know that.
yeah, it is. Yeah, it is because it's so effective. When you start removing deuterium, patients just start skyrocketing with their results that have been stuck for years and frustrated for years.
Sure.
All right, number 33 in the can. Thank you guys so much for joining us. If you know somebody that carries around a half a gallon jug of water, share this with them. You might actually save their back from carrying that Stanley cup around every day. So, Doc, thanks again. Guys, thanks for joining us. We'll see you next week.